I saw the Goatman when I was 9 years old. I was staying with my grandma on a reservation, and I was only supposed to be there for a day when it started to storm badly. This lasted for 4 days. The power was out. No lights, no stove, nothing. My grandma's house was more like a trailer. On the third night, my cousin, my aunt, and I were all sleeping in the living room. And from where I was sleeping, you could see through the kitchen window. I was woken up by the sound of something talking in a strange voice. At the time, I couldn't think of what it reminded me of. But now, after thinking about it for years, it sounded like a goat trying to speak English. I still don't know what it was trying to say, but I heard a deep, "Hey, boys, hey." At first, I thought it was just my cousin being annoying, and then I noticed there was a big figure standing outside the kitchen window, and it had its fists against the glass. And then I noticed it was banging on the window, not hard enough to make too much noise. I saw the outline of horns, similar to a bighorn goat's, and fur was covering its entire body from what I could see. And then lightning flashed, and I saw its face. Very hard to describe, but it looked exactly like what you would imagine Goatman to look like. Red eyes, but not glowing. It looked old and rough. Its fur was mostly gray, with some brown. The window was at least 6 feet tall above the ground, so I would say it was around 7 to 7.5 foot tall. It stayed at the window most of the night, but the banging turned to scratching, and the attempts to speak turned to growls and shouting. Lightning flashed a few more times, and every time I could see the anger on its face growing more and more. The morning after we checked outside for evidence, we found huge hoof prints going from window to window and scratch marks on the windows. The prints were probably the size of 2 open hands.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
The Smithsonian, that if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm. It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
Judd, the myth, the man, the legend, the doctor, whatever you want to call him out there. The doctor is in. Judd, welcome back to Blurry Creatures.
I'm elated to be back. Thank you.
Yeah.
We got a fever and the only prescription.
There's more Burton.
More Burton.
Yeah. That's usually how it works, man.
I'm hurting for some Burton.
Hurting for some Burton.
I've never heard this before, man. Come on.
Anyway, Dr. Judd, thanks for coming back on the show. We got to do our little shtick, spiel. Get this thing rolling. That's what we do, Luke.
Yeah,
we have fun on the old Blurry Creatures. Judd, we've been texting back and forth. We are now friends out of the metaverse into the real,
The Blurryverse.
And a newly minted member.
Shout out to Miss Tori Peterson for fixing me up there.
Yeah.
Number one in our minds, now number one in our hearts, number one on our Blurry Creatures members only page.
That's right. A member, Tori, made Judd a member and baptized him into the Blurry sphere.
Just it's like there's an inception of members going on there. There's a joke in there that's not for a family show, so we'll let that one be.
But we appreciate it, though. Those people that are listening who love the show, they want other people to be a part of the member space.
Yeah.
We got a cool community growing, Judd, and now you're in it. Now you're fact checking people. They can't just post anything now.
Yeah, that's right.
No.
The doctor's in.
But I'll when I fact check and put my 2 cents in, I'll do it. I'll do it as smoothly as I possibly can.
Hey, there's a lot of virtual eye batting like from Indiana Jones.
Oh, please.
Love you. Just a lot of that going on. There was even a meme that made it into the page.
Well, the thing that surprised me was the sultry Southern voice comment.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
love you,
Judd. If you ever need an ego boost, you just come on down. I'll tell you where to find us. We're gonna put the people together and tell you how much we love you.
Well, the Southern thing, I can't deny. I mean, it's just it's as natural as breathing for me. But sultry, that's a new one.
Yeah, we got Bigfoot, Babes, Burton. Let's go.
Southern by the grace of God.
By the grace of God.
That's just the recipe for an old fashioned, the blurry old fashioned.
The blurry old fashioned. Yeah. Oh, dude, just give me a double Burton.
Sounds like something you'd serve in a blurry restaurant.
If you haven't listened to this show ever, you're probably really confused. But
like these guys are just out of it. What's going on here? Yeah.
But Judd, you're our most returned guest, most distinguished,
and most revered at this point too.
Yes,
the Reverend Doctor. I mean, we're gonna have to.
All kidding aside, it is very humbling, and thanks to everybody, for following my work, and I really love this community. It's just fantastic. It feels like home.
Yeah. Me too, man. I love it as well, and it's growing, and people are joining in every day, and it just gets blurrier and blurrier. But we've been texting, Judd, and you were talking about the Goatman, the original Goatman, the satyr, the Pan right. The man.
Yeah, well, most of the conversations that take place on podcasts that I do about Pan inevitably circle back to my dissertation research and my ongoing research on the Pan Azazel connection. And so I rarely have an opportunity to sort of link that to modern stories about goatmen or satyr-like creatures or cryptids, because we're really, just in terms of form, you're kind of dealing with the same thing. Because a lot of the stories about modern goatmen, they not only in terms of the goatman's appearance, but in terms of his demeanor and voice, a lot of this stuff lines up with the characteristics that satyrs and Pan were said to have had in the ancient world.
So some people just think that's absolutely crazy to think that these satyrs existed, walked the earth. Like they can't even consider that. I mean, is that what we're saying? I mean, I think there's obviously a mythology of these things, but
yeah, take us back. What is it? I mean, where does this thing come from? I mean, you got half man, half goat, right? It's a satyr. This is for people that don't have a reference to this. It's funny, like offhandedly through our interviews with Judd, like from the beginning, we've talked a little bit and kind of had a thread of that. There's where Judd is from in Texas. There are, unbelievable or not, there are sightings of a goat man. And this is kind of the nexus or the genesis of this interview and this talk is that, and then you brought in the beginning, and I'm kind of recapping for everybody, but from the beginning you talked about how you did a dissertation on Pan and Peneus, and we've talked about Peneus, and we talk about Mount Hermon, and we talk about the things that happened there, and so there's this crazy convolution and connection of where you actually live and grew up, and then your work and what happened at Mount Hermon, and then, as you just said, the connection between Pan and Azazel, and very, very interested in.
And you are the goat, so.
Oh, here we go.
Oh man, it's that may be the title that I never let go of now because of all the work that I've done. He's the goatiest of all time.
He is
yeah, take us back, Burton.
All the way back.
Well,
beyond.
It's almost got this sort of Lord of the Rings feel to it. Do I need to be singing, far o'er the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old.
The lady's heart's just broke. I just heard him snap in half.
I promise I won't break out the old dwarvish songs too often, but it just seemed appropriate.
This is the best show ever.
Well, dude, didn't you know that Nate's a singer? This is like we're one guy short of a quartet right now.
Yeah. Well, there's some musical people in the Blurry community, man. I don't know if you heard Kenny lay down the dog van riff the other day. Oh my gosh.
You can only play the banjo, the bassoon, or the bass. That's all we got.
Okay.
What about the bongos? Bongos.
Bongos are in. You can do that.
Right. Or the bugle.
Bugle now also approved. We'll vote on that one. Yeah.
Boy, we are so far off the rails right now.
No whiskey, no weed, nothing. We're all sober as
It's like a sober Joe. It's like a sober Joe Rogan show right now.
We'll use the euphemism that Tolkien used. We're merry.
Very.
Oh my gosh, this is pure lightning in a bottle right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's distill it. So as the story unfolds, taking us back beyond the Misty Mountains, in this case, the Misty Mountain, Mount Hermon. That's really kind of the genesis of this, not to use a pun, but kind of the beginning of goat god archetype, because if we trace it back to Azazel, whose name literally means the goat of God. And for listeners who are familiar, most of your listeners are probably familiar with Azazel, the one form or another, and his reference in not just canon, like in Leviticus with the atonement sacrifice, but also in Enoch, where he seems to be the most culpable of the Watchers. It's interesting that centuries later, and in the millennia that followed, you had a whole host of goat deities from that region that often were anthropomorphic too. In other words, they had goat features and human features. Some of them were even phonetically similar in terms of a name, like Uds and Odds. You had the Maru that the Amorites worshipped, he was a shepherd god, just like Pan was supposed to have been. And then you had Adzaga, another goat deity, and then the Bennu, which was an Assyrian goat demon who was also sort of anthropomorphic. And think of a Pan-like creature, satyr-like creature with a forked snake tongue. So he was kind of a nasty dude.
Sounds like a Baphomet or something like that. Like
approaching that. Yeah.
Yeah.
A number of years ago, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, they found what I think is to date the most detailed drawing or etching of Bennu, thrown in with some, I think it was a collection of apotropaic incantations, these things that were supposed to ward off evil spirits. And of all things, they found this in a cave in northern Iraq, which would have been in the heartland of Assyria. And so there are any number of these kinds of goat deities, but what's interesting is that at the foot of Mount Hermon, on the southwestern slope, you had the establishment of a shrine to Pan at this gaping cave in the region. And even the Levant had its own, satyr creatures, and they show up in the Old Testament in a number of places, but notably in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 14, which is the same verse that references the Lilith as well. Usually that's translated as he-goats, but the word used there in Hebrew is shedim. And these are clearly these demonic half-goat, half-man creatures. And I think a lot of this goes back to not the hominid Nephilim of the pre-flood world, but the chimeric Nephilim that the Watchers helped create when they were tinkering around with the DNA of animals, which is intimated in the text there. I think it gets in about chapter in First Enoch 8 or 9, somewhere along in there. But
does it describe at all how that went down?
No, the idiom there is that the Watchers sinned against the birds and reptiles and other creatures, and it's all within the context of what's been dubbed the Genesis 6 experiment.
It's like all manner of flesh was corrupted, right? It's that whole idea.
But as far as the exact mechanism, I mean, it's anybody's guess, really. It could be purely clinical, or it could be, it could be some form of bestiality. We just don't know.
So I have a question, Judd. So we know Azazel was one of the Watchers that descended to Mount Hermon, right? He's one of the named Watchers. Is this his association with the Pan creature, this satyr? Is the connection there that he was called the goat of heaven, and then he has some hand in the creation or the amalgamation of this?
I think so. I think that's, with the evidence that we have at hand, I think that's the conclusion that we have to come to at the end of the day. And again, given the proximity of Mount Hermon to Peneus, to my mind, you're looking at just the continuation of Azazel's legacy there. And there are certainly evidences that go beyond the Roman, late Roman, and Byzantine world.
You could say goat beyond.
Good.
Yeah. Goat beyond. There's another one.
Yes,
We're gonna say that one.
You could, but you may not. You know.
Yeah, I know. Don't do it.
You could. Yeah, you could do a lot of things.
I'm just surprised you didn't.
That's
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Continue.
Go to head.
Oh my gosh!
It's just you're so full of it on a Friday afternoon.
Man, this guy. Dude.
I mean, come on.
He's been telling dinosaur jokes with his kids.
This essentially, this sets up certainly the ancient and definitely the most antique beginnings of these deities. And I made the assertion in my dissertation work that because of many of these reasons, that coupled with what we already knew about Orientalizing, which was an effect usually through trade that the Levant had on the Greek world, we know that there were a number of high points in this, but the two big ones were during the Mycenaean period and the Archaic period in Greek history. But that influence was always there. It's interesting when you start to consider Greek mythology, because so many of the Greeks thought that a number of their, if not most of their gods, came from the East. They were heavily influenced by Near Eastern thought. And there are a number of us who have written about this, including myself, but also Dr. Heiser and Derek Gilbert, just off the top of my head. I know Doug Hamp has written some on it as well. But that, and it's certainly something that Eastern influence, Near Eastern influence on Greek mythology is certainly attested in any number of works, not the least of which is the East Face of the Helicon. That's probably the most comprehensive work that talks about it. So it's not so far-fetched to say that beyond the theological reasons that we have, but there are cultural and historical reasons to believe that Pan and these goat deities all trace back to the Levant in general, and Mount Hermon specifically, with the beginning of them, with the Zazel.
Judd, I think it's fascinating, the idea that when we go to the Genesis 6 event, right, you have the offspring of the Watchers being the Nephilim giants, but then we don't talk about this other thing. We do, but not a whole lot, where the deification of what would assume to be the chimerical offspring of these same 200 Watchers or so, especially when you have the named one. I think it's just fascinating that the deification of the Pan creature, and then pulling that thread back to a Watcher, because we know that they're human hybrid offspring, set themselves up as the rulers of the known world. And yet you have this sort of weird creature thing that happens, and no accident, Nate's on the show. We talk about this on the show here, but we know from our conversations with you earlier that you have Pan and Peneus, and you have these altars to Peneus, and yet it's this chimerical offspring. Do you think that this is obviously was a real creature, but do you think the Pan as it exists and the Penaic worship, do you think that is a representative worship of Azazel, or do you think that there's an actual chimerical offspring that we can pull a thread to Azazel that became, not unlike a Titan or unlike a Nephilim?
Well, I think it's sort of they're all part of the same,
like a yes and
like cult family. It's a legacy kind of a thing. But undoubtedly, whatever appellation we give them, we're talking about the same group of supernatural beings. Pan probably stems, at least the imagery of Pan probably stems from, the earliest appearance of these kinds of chimerical creatures that show up in really world mythology. I mean, these half goat, half ram, half sheep deities, they creatures, they show up in lots of places. Some we're more familiar with than others, but their behavior is generally the same, quite sprightly, if not pornographic in many instances, often having a very disturbing, deep voice. Like Pan is said to have had, his voice was said to instill terror. That's where we get the word panic from. In the Greek source material, Pan was instrumental in helping the Olympians defeat the Titans, and in particular Zeus defeating Typhon by using his battle cry. And so we're looking at a legacy cult in a lot of ways, but undoubtedly what numbers of these creatures existed, as the Hebrews called them, the Shedim, the early sort of pictorial manifestation of Pan, how people undoubtedly all throughout the Near East and eventually the Greek world began to think about and depict satyrs in the Greek world, and later on fauns in the Roman world. But as I say, these are creatures that you find in world mythology all over the place. Krampus, the anti-claus, as it were, is an example of a goat, half man sort of deity. The puckish sprites from Celtic mythology that Shakespeare peppers some of his work, like Midsummer Night's Dream, would be other examples of that. And again, their demeanor sort of lines up with the sprightly behavior of satyrs as they're depicted in the Greek source material.
Judd, do you think that, so obviously when you have, like what Luke was just saying a little while ago about, we don't really talk about the giants all the time. We don't talk about the chimerical creatures as much. Are these things more animal-like, or are they more angelic? And what kind of DNA do you think it is? Is it like an angel goes to an animal, or is it like a possessed animal and then another animal? I mean, are these things talking to people? Are these things communicating? Are they just look like a beast, but they're actually like sort of an angelic being, you think?
I think all of those are really fair game. I mean, as I pointed out, it's difficult to say.
I just wonder if there's any mythology, any stories that lead us to believe that these things were more than just animals.
Well, I mean, they're sentient. I mean, in the case of the satyrs, yeah, they could talk. They were
fascinating.
Pan was a musician too.
Yeah, lured you away with the flute, right?
The panpipes, which and there's a whole mythology behind that too. The Syrinx.
He was a flautist.
He was.
Don't get him on his Ron Burgundy. I knew it's coming.
You're just peppering the path with this stuff today.
Hey, I'm trying.
Yeah, we are.
So, although we don't know the exact mechanism, you can discern at the end of the day that these things are sentient, because we have record of them, conversing with mortals and immortals alike. If you dig into the mythologies of particularly the Greek stuff, it's the most explicit. I think you have to come away with the sense of the fact that these aren't they're not like parrots, or birds that can mimic.
Yeah.
They're sentient entities that are interacting with humankind.
Judd, how does that goat representation, and I kind of mentioned it once or twice, but how does that pull through to like the Baphomet, into this association with Satan?
Yeah, we get a lot of depictions in later, let's say in late antiquity, particularly going into the Dark Ages and the High Middle Ages. We start to get that goat imagery of the devil, and it's really kind of an amalgamation. As far as that's concerned, I think that the Azazel Pan imagery is sort of baggage that gets pulled into that representation, not only in the popular mind, but also in pop culture and art during the Dark Ages and the High Middle Ages, because Europe, as I alluded to a moment ago, its lore was so peppered with these half goat, half person, kind of sprightly entities, that it seemed, it was almost natural to kind of vilify this imagery. And this became the face of the devil in medieval Europe, and it, as you point out, we retain that imagery to this day. But if we go back to the origins, that imagery belonged to Azazel, and that's why I say that it's sort of Azazel baggage that gets dragged into the whole, sort of, for lack of a better metaphor, wanted poster that Western culture draws up for Satan.
So it's just like some bad alchemy, really, right?
Yeah. I mean, but you can understand how that imagery ensconces itself, because of the Levitical material, where we actually have the Azazel goat in the atonement ritual. that undoubtedly helped to foster the making of this image of the devil in European and Western culture.
Judd, I have a question for you. So, I grew up in the church. Obviously, you hear the sheep and the goats, and, you hear Jesus talks about that, and you just assume that means the saved and the unsaved or the lost, right? But then there's other stories that say, like, Jesus will go after the lost sheep. And so we're seeing a clear delineation between sheep and goats. Mm-hmm. And do you think this is like the seed of Satan versus God's seed? Is it now that all the things we've learned, is that what? Or is it saved and unsaved? Or is it all the above? Or I don't know.
I think in that case it's more saved and unsaved. I don't know that there's an allusion being made there to now other than
it's just funny they use goats.
Well, I think actually this, because that statement it's about redemption and atonement. I think he may actually be referring to, in this case, to some extent, the atonement ritual, because the Jews knew that this this Azazel goat was not offered to Yahweh as a sacrifice. It was a symbol of all of the sin that had been committed and was turned loose into the wilderness, or bound up and then tossed over a cliff, in much the same way that Azazel is punished in the pre-flood world. And so I think because the Watchers are beyond that redemption, I think he is making a clear delineation between those who are savable and those who are not, or those who are not saved. But there is a kind of slight allusion to the imagery from the atonement ritual in Leviticus. And of course, that involves Azazel, and you definitely have the goat reference, goat imagery there.
You have multiple descriptions of the goat man. You have the fawn, the satyrs. I mean, I don't know if some of these are like make believe, like they're just fictional writings, but I mean, how many versions of the goat man are there?
Well, there are numerous, many. My same marker of qualification stands here. Even if fraction of these reports and accounts in the ancient world are sort of the telephone game or what, telephone cord game or whatever, you're still left with a portion of them that you have to consider as at least possible. So I think it's a little more than just campfire stories. Yeah. I think, particularly because we have a reference to it in the Bible, in the Old Testament. I think that for believers, that should be the litmus test right there, because you've got a number of mentions of the Shedim in the Old Testament. So clearly, these represent not only belief, but in a lot of cases, probably are reflective of direct experience. And the same can be said for people in other cultures who encounter these entities.
What's the significance of, because you talked about Pan, the temple to Pan, or the altar to Pan, and its location, specific geolocation there at Mount Hermon by the cave. Can you talk a little bit about what Jesus might have been doing, showing up there, talking about and there's this very famous stuff we've covered on the show with you as well about the gates of hell will not prevail on this rock, but specifically, how do you think, or what are your thoughts on the relation to the Panaic cult and its specific location right there where Jesus showed up to do what, as Jesus did very intentionally, to be where he was, and to say the things he said?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because there's kind of a shepherd's war going on here. You have the God of the shepherds on the one hand at Penais, and then you have the good shepherd on the other hand. And just for brief review, Jesus chose this place to make the statements he did in the establishment of the church because of what had happened there, the history that it had with the Watchers and the Giants, Mount Hermon being right there, Og's kingdom just to the east, the apostate tribe of Dan's territory just across the valley to the west, all the stuff in the Golan, legacy of various tribes of giants in the region, and the firing of a shot over the enemy's bow, for all intents and purposes. Like our buddy Mike Kaiser says, Jesus went there to pick a fight. And I'm always revisiting this material, but I think another layer meaning here has to do with the timing of Jesus's arrival. Okay. So I told you guys I was going to drop a bombshell on the show today.
Yeah, you did.
This is as good a time as any. So I'm working on a new paper about the timing of Jesus's visit to Caesarea Philippi, Paneas. We've known for some time, and the best that we can come up with is that Jesus and the disciples came here in the winter before Jesus's crucifixion. And I started thinking, I wonder if there's something here at play that might be sort of hiding in plain sight, like a lot of this stuff is, to kind of help us maybe understand a little more detail, maybe get a more accurate bearing on when Jesus might have visited there, not just the season, but maybe an actual date. We scholars, those of us who have researched Paneas and its history, know that the Lupercalia, or the festival that was dedicated to Pan in Roman culture, took place on February the 15th. And it was celebrated in Paneas with great pomp and ritual, as you might expect. In a place that was known as the city of Pan, you would expect nothing less. And so it began to dawn on me that perhaps the period of the Lupercalia would have been a more ideal time that Jesus chose to visit Paneas when they were celebrating this festival to Pan, if we're to believe what scholars like T.P. Weissman and T.J. Cornell write about in their work. If Jesus is firing the shot over the enemy's bow, then this would just be another layer of warning and insult to the demonic realm. And so the more that I dig into this, the more I'm convinced that Jesus and the disciples not only arrived at Paneas in a general sense in the winter before his death, but I think the best time would have been the later period in winter during the Lupercalia, February the 15th on the Roman calendar, during this festival of Pan. 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 During this festival of Pan.
Wow. So he shows up to crash the party.
Yeah, he shows up to crash the party. Exactly.
So it seems so intentional, right? And so specifically,
so deliberate.
Yes.
Do you think that Jesus has more than an entourage following him? Do you think there's more people coming with him than just disciples?
Well, I don't know about. I mean, there may have been other of his followers that came. We get the sense from the text that it's just the 12. But even, there's so much of that lore that would have been known not just to Jewish people living in the region, but also the Etyrians, who were Greco-Roman in terms of culture. They were the indigenous people living there. They would have, the timing of Jesus' arrival and what he's saying, about all of this stuff wouldn't have been lost on them either. So I think that there were a number of audiences that Jesus hit with this message while he was there.
Obviously, we talk a lot about realms and things that are happening in the realms we can't see. We don't know what's going on. Jesus moving into the dark area of this festival at a certain time, saying certain things, and human beings are kind of just blissfully unaware of it.
Maybe, again, but again, this goes back to the fact that whether they were Jew or pagan here, there was something in Jesus's timing and what he said, everything he does at Paneas, that they would have connected with. Now, as far as like those of us, in the wake of all this, in the centuries and millennia in the wake of that, this is kind of, like I said before, it's stuff that's sort of hiding in plain sight, but it's historically, culturally, and theologically relevant to be thinking at and trying to get at the details of this particular episode in Jesus' ministry.
Hey, Judd, I want to fast forward now. We've been going backwards.
Okay.
Hey, talk a little bit about why this is relevant to your hometown and where you are, and tell us a little bit about the lore that happens around.
There actually is some Goatman lore attached to my hometown, Merkel. And I wrote about it at some length in my book, The Paranormal Big Country, which is a kind of historical ethnographic treatment of the folklore in this region of Texas. And I remember hearing Goatman stories from the time when I was probably 6 or 7, when you start to become old enough to kind of get a little bit of a grasp on the reality of the situation. But that, the figure, the one in question, was supposed to have lived south of town and would stop people along this road that was locally known as Devil's Backbone, and pounce on their car and kind of terrorize the occupants, and in some cases become even a little more violent than that. And he was said to have a very deep voice, a very basso, disturbing voice, like Pan did in Greek mythology. There's another one of those features. And it was supposed to have, in some of the recounted stories, was supposed to have carried an axe with him. Now, of course, as I got older, and certainly when I went to college, I was talking to people from all over the state. They were like, "Oh, we've got a Goatman too, down in South Central Texas, or we got a Goatman in East Texas or North Texas or what have you." And I was just sort of fascinated and, filed those accounts away and dug a little bit into the Texas lore. Now, as it turns out, there are Goatman sightings all over the states, but abundantly in places like Maryland, or some of the earlier ones in the 20th century were recounted, and in Texas. Now these stories undoubtedly existed before they were actually covered by newspapers. One of the earliest that I've seen is the Lake Worth monster. And this was a story that was done in 1969, I believe, in the Fort Worth Telegram. And Fort Worth is just about 3 hours to the east of me here. And, here again, you've got this creature people describe as looking like half goat, half man, white fur. And the story behind this, and also a lot of the Maryland sightings in particular, is that this was some sort of genetic experiment gone awry. That the Department of Agriculture was somehow involved, and or this fellow was a scientist working, at some government facility and escaped. Well, we know for a fact that we've been making all kinds of human-animal chimera for decades. That truth is just starting to bubble to the surface now, but we've had the technology to do that for quite some time. And so here we have the return of this kind of chimera into the modern world, just sort of repeating in many ways what happened in the pre-flood Genesis 6 experiment.
Yeah.
Which is why I think that just in terms of quantity, I think that's why we see more and more cryptid sightings these days, is because that kind of thing is going on. But yeah, it's really strange that a lot of my specialization went to understanding, not only the history of that part of Israel, but also, the goat deities and goat entities that were associated with it. And I grew up with stories about hearing about this thing.
Did you ever meet one and teach you how to play guitar?
No, I didn't. I never had a crossroads experience with Goatman, thank God.
I mean, goats are just creepy looking in general, which is funny.
Yeah, they sure do taste. They taste good though.
Yeah. Their milk's great, and it's easy to digest.
I ate some goat when I was in Afghanistan.
We used to make cabrito every spring when I was in the Anthropology Society.
But just the goat eyes, just the way they look at you, it's just they're creepy.
Yeah.
How many goats you been staring down, Nate?
My kids go to the petting zoo.
Oh, so you have been staring down goats.
Yeah, just looking at them, staring down the goats. Yeah, they're just looking at you.
I caught the reference.
I saw it, Luke. I saw it.
Men that stare at goats. Yes.
Men that stare at goats.
So
Yes.
Judd, you think that the ones that people are seeing today are like remnants of the because obviously we talk about that a lot on the show, like second incursions. How do these things come back? I mean, if giants can come back, why not Goatman, right?
Well, I think there has to be room for that, because that's why I distinguish between the hominid Nephilim and the chimera Nephilim, is because there were anthropomorphic giants, and then there were these chimera that were products of this experiment. And yeah, I think there were probably some early post-flood experimentation going on too, because as I've alluded to a number of times, the watcher knowledge was passed down. If we're to believe the account about Arphaxad and Canaan and the apocryphal material, then they recovered some of it that the watchers actually wrote down on some rocks. So there's a good chance that, that was part of a reboot program, so to speak. But, now you could certainly call it watcher tech if you want, particularly if we've been making these chimera for the last, few decades. I don't see any other way to categorize it, particularly if you're looking through the biblical lens. I don't think you can categorize it any other way as an indication of the return of the Nephilim.
Yeah, it's just fascinating, like just to try to figure out how this stuff returns, how it comes back. And obviously it feels like more modern day stuff is more test tubes and science, and humans have slowly been building up our knowledge. We're getting closer to probably where, maybe not even near where the Watchers were, but it's like we can kind of tinker around. I think the chimeras of the Old Testament, to me, seem like they were probably more like a purebred, like an intentional bastardization of God's creation, versus today we're just trying to figure out if we can even put these two things together. We don't really know what the hell we're doing. I think they knew what they were doing.
Well,
I think they knew exactly what they were doing.
You're presupposing that there's no contact between the people that are making these things and the unseen realm, and I don't think that's the case.
CERN, right?
You wonder though, but I mean, are all these people like diving into, like, going through satanic rituals to tap into this? I mean, scientists can't all be that privy to that.
Well, no, I don't think that you can't vilify the entire scientific community, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any people that aren't doing it.
I'm just wondering, like, you hear stories in China where they're making the Goatman or the pig human hybrid. Like, are they even aware of what they're doing?
Well, that's a great question, and I just gave you the two options. I mean, there's certainly scientists that are probably attached to some of those programs that it's so compartmentalized they don't know what the end result is. And then on the other hand, you may have scientists who have direct knowledge of what we're calling watcher knowledge from the sources.
Some people have connected Satan to music, and then there's like this idea of goat imagery in music and satanic symbolism. Is there some sort of musical connection there between the goat imagery and?
Other than Pan, like I pointed out a minute ago, the Pan imagery sort of being Azazel imagery sort of being wrested from Azazel and used to
panpipes.
Used to describe Satan. Unless you connect them directly with the Pan's affinity for the panpipes, I don't see any other connection. Now there was a chord, a triad of notes that in the Middle Ages people thought sounded like it was demonic, and this was called the Devil's Triad. And you hear it in some rock music. It's that dum dum dum. That's supposedly the Devil's Triad.
Oh, I thought that was the brown note.
The brown note. No, that was Eddie Van Halen. That was Eddie Van Halen.
All right, I got a last question about Goatman, at least from my end.
Okay.
If we were to catch Goatman and eat him, would that be cannibalism or would that be tacos?
I think technically the word would be tacobalism.
This guy.
No, yeah, that's a bad one. We could cut that one out.
Yeah, that'd be the worst.
Hey, Judd,
like
that's
street
the worst.
taco.
Yeah, that's just
food. Yeah.
Hey, at least Goatman could get around a little easier in the ancient days, climbing those mountains.
Yeah, I mean, he like a billy goat, right? That's what they say. Like,
see those goats that go straight up a mountain.
Yeah.
And they're always obsessed with mountains.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go.
Sure-footed. Here we go.
Look at Nate pulling threads. Here we are.
Yeah, these. I remember being a kid and we were hiking around Glacier National Park, and I was just amazed watching these goats go straight up the hill. I remember being a kid. And they were just right there on the trail.
We were just in Colorado. We were just in Colorado for all of our fertility stuff, and you get once you get into the mountains there, it's crazy. They're like they find these places to perch and then sometimes they come down and cross the road, and you're just like, this is wild.
Well, it just makes you think, like, why did they choose certain animals? I mean, it seems like goats are kind of like, let's get in one of those animals. And
they chose horses too, man. We have centaurs.
Yep.
They didn't get into llamas though. They just left them alone.
We don't know that. Maybe they did down in South America. You never know.
Do you think they got into llamas?
They had jaguar human
don't
things.
Don't you know they named the first of those chimera Lorenzo?
There he is. There he is.
Lorenzo Llama?
Yeah, Lorenzo Llama. Llama red pajama.
Oh my gosh. It's getting wild on this show. I love it. I think it's fascinating.
Judd, when was the last Goatman sighting down there in Merkel? Do you know?
The last one that I know of was probably about 25 years ago.
So he's been hiding.
Well, I mean, the stories are still around. I mean, people still talk about it.
Well, maybe 25 years ago, maybe you heard George Strait and thought he'd be in Amarillo by morning.
he could have.
And he's moved on.
Except he didn't. He lost a wife and a nymph, not a wife and a girlfriend.
It's true. Yes.
broke his leg in San Antonio.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, check yes or no, right?
All right.
I have a funny story though, Judd. One of my professors in college, she talked kind of like a goat, and so my buddy got everyone in the class to play a game, see who could do the loudest goat noise without getting caught, and it'd be dead silent in the class, and someone would go, meh, meh, and we just all start laughing. It was the worst all class long. That's probably why you quit teaching.
This lady's traumatized now.
Probably so.
She can't go anywhere near the petting zoo. It's game over.
She had like a nervous talk, like, "Oh, well, let's go today," and then everyone started doing it was so bad, so mean.
That's terrible.
This is what
25 years ago.
Hope you repented of that, by the way.
I did.
That's good.
Poor Judd. You had to deal with guys like me in class.
Yeah.
He's just like, I'm quitting.
That means mid to late 90s. The Goatman moved on. I mean, he saw that all the good music was already behind him, and so he might have
popped his head back up in the early to mid 2000s.
Exactly.
If it was for the music, yeah. It's like, oh, heavy metal's not dead.
Judd, do you think Tolkien and C.S. Lewis knew about these creatures and they had pulled from the history and they wrote them into their stories because it wasn't fantasy to them? It was actually like more an understood part of history.
I think so, particularly Tolkien. You just. I've recently reread The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring. It's hard to look at Tolkien's world and not see the influence that he took from the Bible, and I'm not just talking about the Christology that you see in the story of the Lord of the Rings, but I'm talking about the entire world that he created. If you read the Silmarillion, which is kind of the mythology and the backstory to Middle Earth, he models Iluvatar and the host that create the world, Arda. It's just divine council stuff. Iluvatar is Yahweh, very clearly. And all of these other beings are angels. They're celestial beings. And you even have a Satan figure, Melkor, either one of the Maiar or the Valar, I can't remember. But one of the Valar, I think, who goes against the song of creation. But looking into Tolkien's world, of like the orcs and the goblins and the trolls and the all of the malicious, wicked creatures. I don't think you can get very far into that without realizing that Tolkien knew and understood the Genesis 6 episode, because take the Uruk-hai, for instance. They were a special kind of orc, or just the orcs in general. Their origins were, they weren't created. They were a manipulation of creation. The dark powers, in particular Melkor, who became Morgoth, and Sauron, were the ones behind the creation of the orcs. We get a kind of quick lesson from this from Christopher Lee as Saruman in the movie, where he talks about how the dark powers took elves, tortured and manipulated them and changed them into the orcs. That's straight out of Genesis 6 by way of Enoch, with the tampering with the other kinds of animals, or just tampering with genetics in general. And I mentioned the Uruks because they were taller in stature than the other orcs.
And it makes you wonder, before some of the powers that be hijack some of these ancient writings that maybe these dudes had access to. You wonder how much stuff's been buried.
Well, I think at the end of the day, the thing that shines out in their work is the reflection of how the biblical narrative influenced these stories. Not that they were doing that outright now to make them a ministerial tool, but you can't really get away from those kinds of influences. And Tolkien and Lewis were both, just tremendous minds. They were brilliant, so, I mean, Tolkien was a linguist, and it wouldn't have been beyond his ability to analyze this Near Eastern stuff, even though his specialty were Western and Germanic languages. And I've heard all kinds of criticisms about, they're using all kinds of occult imagery or something like that, or that they were involved in, secret societies or whatever. Most of the criticisms I see coming against them are from people who have not read their works. In Lewis's case, either they're fiction or nonfiction, but haven't read their works or done much research into their backgrounds.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, the short answer to that is that both Lewis and Tolkien understood the language of mythology, like few people do in the West.
Yeah, I know.
That's why it's so good. That's why it resonates, right? It's all the old stories just brought to life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
These are they're timeless stories. Yeah. And, long before had Campbell talking about the hero's journey, articulating the hero's journey, people like Tolkien were infusing it with Christology.
Yeah.
I mean, the ultimate hero's journey, really.
And speaking of ultimate hero, Dr. Judd Burton, ladies and gentlemen.
Look at that. Look at that right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, Luke's got to get to game night.
Yeah, I got a couple minutes to wrap this up here, but it's fascinating to hear, I feel like we're almost like correspondent on the ground from the epicenter of Goatman sightings. We've got Judd Burton. Judd, checking in. What we got? And here we are. We got all the way back to Mount Hermon, to Merkel, Texas, and we've rounded and come all the way back.
Yeah, that's a memoir title right there, from Merkel to Mount Hermon.
Hey, dude, you know what? I'll take a 2% royalty. Appreciate it.
All right.
Now, with Judd, thanks so much. Just thanks so much for the time and talking about this creature, and also connecting it back to the scriptures and to the things we've talked about on Mount Hermon, which is the epicenter for all this. And
from DJB.
My pleasure.
DJB. Dr. Judd Burton.
Coming up with DJB up next.
Spinning the hits. They just keep on coming.
The classics. Goat Rock. DJB. Dr. Judd, go to BurtonBeyond.com, buy his books, make him a wealthy man. Dr. Love.
Dr. Love.
We can't get enough of you.
Rich in love and knowledge.
Well, do what I can.
Yes, I appreciate you just letting us razz you and make jokes and having you on the team.
Oh, it's all good. Like I said, this is home. This is home.
If you've seen a Goatman out there, anybody listening, hit us up.
Yes.
We don't know anything about the Goatman. We want to hear about this. Well, Dr. Judd, thanks, buddy.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Love you, bro. We do. So
Yeah, we
appreciate you as always.
Love you guys too.
I appreciate it.
Peace out.
See you.
See ya.